Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, good day, good week, good everything. Thank you all for joining me. I am Purple Haze, and if y'all cannot tell, I am super excited about this interview. I've been hinting at it in my streams now for about a month, and it is finally happening. If you can't tell, we're in the daytime, so this is a premiere, but I'm going to be in the chat. So Future Purple, to let people know you're in the chat, say hello. But for everyone else, this should be after my last stream. I should beat the final boss in Tomb Raider. And as y'all know, I am super excited because we have someone who's intimately familiar with Laura. Y'all know, Texan, I can't pronounce it right, but she's going to pronounce it authentically and super awesome. So before I'm not going to ruin it. I want her to explain who she is. Without further ado, Rhi, how are you?
I'm good, thanks. Yeah, I'm coming to you from the very warm, only going to get warmer UK at the moment. So we're going through a heat wave at the moment. So none of us really know what to do in the UK. So we're just sitting in front of fans and slowly melting.
Oh my gosh. No, we definitely have Petter Games, David Wilson, Rock, Clive, Baba Bear Gaming. They're all from the UK. They all come into the show, so that y'all are all kind of Holtz, we can't forget Holtz, he's there too. So they're always coming through the channel and saying what's up and everything. So feel your pain because they've been talking about it all week.
Oh yeah. It's like we've had our first like red warning in the UK ever for.
What's a red warning?
So we have like amber and red warnings for like floods, winds, any kind of like bad weather. And it's the first like red warning we've had for heat in the UK ever. Like it's now like we're going up around 40 Fahrenheit, sorry, 40 Celsius on Tuesday, I think, which is like the highest ever recorded.
That's actually, so I don't know the conversions. I know all y'all who are like,
yeah, I'm trying to think what the conversion is.
Like, but I never ever heard of 40 Celsius when talking about weather. I know it's always like in the high 20s, mid 30s.
Yeah, I'm trying to work it out, but I can't find anything that converts.
It's too high. It's too high. It's like it doesn't belong that high.
Yeah, it kind of runs out of icons and how to display the weather, and it's just got a thermometer, which just, if you see the thermometer, you know it's really, really.
Okay, there we go. 104. You know, our co-producer just
it's
got
not
that.
too bad today. It's a high of 28 today, but yeah, it's going up to around 40 on Tuesday, and everyone's very worried about that. So I'm going to be, ice machine is going to be on. I'm going to be putting ice in my cat's water. I'm going to be sitting them in front of fans and things like that.
Well, if you need a fan right now, we totally understand. We don't want you falling out in this interview. Hopefully it's a cool interview and not a super warm one. That makes sense.
Well, some warmth. It's nice.
Yeah, of course. Oh. So, for everyone, you know, a lot of us know your work, right? Let's start off with, you know, Tomb Raider, Rise of the Tomb Raider, Mirror's Edge, Heavenly Sword, you know, a Stadia favorite in Lost Words. You are a story creator, but in your own words, who is Rhi?
Ooh, I mean, story creator is a good word. Like I'm many things, I guess. I think of myself as sort of, I do think almost like a writer first, a story creator first, but you know, I'm kind of chaotic and silly. I love cats and plants and the Moomins and scuba diving. But yeah, I mean, story creation is what I do across medias as well. So I've worked quite a bit in comics. I've worked in film and TV. I've written a fighting fantasy book. I've written a tabletop role-playing game. You know, I've written for mobile games and indie games and AAA games. So I really like learning about storytelling in different fields, and that's what's particularly interesting to me. So I've never felt the need or desire to specialize in one particular area, although I was very specialized in games for a long time and wasn't doing anything else. But I actually like, you know, working on a comic one day and working on a game another day, or working on, you know, a TV pitch or something like that. I like, it's not just changing lanes, it's changing cars basically. And I like that. I like to I like to mix things up a bit, and it just keeps my mind engaged if there's kind of new things, on the horizon, and new things to learn and new ways of telling stories.
Oh my gosh, this is gonna be I'm so excited because you just giving me some stuff I want to hit on here later on. But this is a gaming channel. I don't know if you've heard of it, but my preferred platform is Google Stadia, which is it's a streaming platform, and that's how I got really connected to your work, because we on the platform there's a few of the games there. But before we really dive into that work and what it means, where did your gaming journey begin? Were you into it as a kid, or is it something like you just didn't do?
Oh yeah, it started very early on. My father was very into games and electronics and robotics and things like that. So he brought home a Sinclair ZX81. I think it's a Sinclair ZX81, a black and white, very bulky machine, very, very blocky games. And I was about 6, and it was a game called Mazogs. And it was like little pixelated man running around a little pixelated maze, and there was like little pixelated crabby creatures that come after him. And Dad said I was quite scared of it initially, and then I realized little pixelated man could pick up little pixelated sword and fight the little pixelated crabby creatures, and that was a revelation for me when I realized that you could fight back. It was like, that's my sense of justice and righteousness. And I watched a lot of kind of sword and sorcery movies as a kid, so Beastmaster, Hawk the Slayer, Conan, and that sort of thing. So, I knew what to do with the sword, and that started a long-term love affair. And I'd play games with my dad, and I like making games a social experience, even if even before they were social in the way they are now. So he'd sort of drive the games, and I would sit next to him, and I'd have the graph paper out, and I'd be drawing the maps for him, because this is long before you got maps in the games, or even like maps in the box, when a long time ago, back in the midst of time.
Wow, this is like serious, like this is dedication to drawing.
But yeah, sometimes you'd have to draw your own. So I'd be like the navigator, and he'd be the driver. Or sometimes I just tuck myself in the back of his very big office chair, and then sort of peek out from behind. But yeah, I think Dad liked an audience for gaming. So even when I was well into adulthood, I used to sort of talk to him while he was playing games, and watch him playing games. And I used to play games with the little girl that lived next door. So I lived in a tiny village. Like we were too small to even be a one-horse town. Like, it was a sneeze of houses, and there was like very few other kids to play with. So I was very excited when I was 11 and an 8-year-old girl moved next door, and her dad worked for Hewlett Packard, and so she would get all the Hewlett Packard machines, so we could play games like the original Monkey Island and King's Quest and Police Quest. And Leisure Suit Larry, which like back then was sort of technically an 18 rated game. I mean, again, it's just like a little pixelated man again, but you had, and the way it gatekeepered the game was it asked you like, are you 18 questions, but they're all like about the American political process. So we would find that sometimes we'd actually go and have to look things up in an encyclopedia to get into a game, which I think is brilliant. And so there was an 11-year-old and 8-year-old girl playing Leisure Suit Larry, and we learned the word prophylactic from Leisure Suit Larry, which I think is an important word for young women to know, and young men as well.
And for everybody who doesn't know it, what does it mean?
It's a very long word for a condom, really, which I don't, because we didn't really use it in the UK. We don't really say prophylactic. So yeah, that was, and it was like, oh, that's a nice word. I wonder what that means. And to the dictionary again. Learned the word falafel from I think it was Conquest of Camelot, which was a big favorite of mine. And it's just like, I didn't, obviously the sneeze of houses in rural Somerset that I grew up in, like no one had even seen a falafel or heard of a falafel, and they sounded really exciting and exotic. It probably took about another 15 years until I had a falafel, and it was a very underrated experience for me. But then I went to the East and had proper falafel in Dubai.
Yeah.
I was just like, this is the falafel of my dreams. This is the falafel from Conquest of Camelot. So it's fun. Yeah, I learned I learned words in those games, which were great. Yeah, and I used to play them with the little girl lived next door, and I used to swap games, usually adventure games, things like Gabriel Knight, and yeah, more Monkey Island games with some of my friends at school. And it sort of grew from there, really. I got into the industry through the journalism route. So I worked as initially an editorial assistant for PC Zone magazine on staff. And just before that, I'd started doing freelance reviewing. And I actually reviewed for a women's magazine. That's my first game writing gig, was for a women's magazine called Minx. That was aimed at 18 to 24-year-old women. And yeah, it was unprecedented then for magazines to really cover games, and they don't really anymore, or they don't now. So it was kind of a very unusual route to get into, and I probably reviewed games for maybe 4 issues, and I'd done a couple of small pieces for them. I think I'd on one piece on graphic novels, one on female gamers. And they decided to let me cover games, and then they sort of basically redesigned and became all about lipstick and boys, like every other magazine, and they dropped games. But I just got it. I managed to get in enough to start getting code coming through from PRs, and a lot of the PRs back then, the majority of them were female, and so they were. I think if you were writing for a female magazine, it was just like, I think they were quite excited about it. So I managed to get a fair bit of code, and then I could find other places to put it. And I started working for PC Gear magazine, and then I was recommended for a staff job on PC Zone. And so I went all around the world interviewing and previewing games, and I ran the back section of the magazine where all the little weird bits and pieces go. that was my section. It was just weird bits and pieces, and I was there for a couple of years, and it was really good fun, and I made lots of sort of connections there. And then I decided to go freelance again. I worked a lot for The Guardian. That's always been very supportive of games, and it used to have a whole tech supplement back then, and it used to devote quite a portion of that to games. And I wrote for Yahoo and the Sunday Times and all sorts of other places, until I was asked if I wanted to be a story editor for Larian, for a game of theirs called Beyond Divinity. And that was a sequel to a game that I really liked of theirs called Divine Divinity, which is a terrible name. They will admit that it's a terrible name.
Divine Divinity. It's
Divine Divinity. And I really enjoyed it. Like, I was quite an excitable reviewer, because I don't know, if I really got into a game, I really sort of fell in love and was, wrote very excitable reviews for it. And my team always joked that I wanted to give everything like a classic award, which was like the highest award in the magazine. And one of the games I really liked, and I was in line with the American press. Like, the American press really liked it as well, but the rest of the British press were a bit like about it. And that was Divine Divinity, and it was kind of a Baldur's Gate-ish, like very similar to how it is now, actually. But there weren't so many games around like that, so it was really nice to see, because there hadn't really been anything like that since the sort of Baldur's Gate, Icewind Dale, and things like that. So I was very excited about it, and it had a sense of humor, and I think the developers remembered me and remembered I liked it, and I'd just gone freelance. And so they sort of said, do you want a job as a story editor? Because they were working on a game that had been written by a non-native English speaker, and they just needed someone to help, like, polish things up, put things together, maybe do a bit of original content. And yeah, it just seemed like a really good way of kind of paying the bills. That wasn't like, the endless round of pitching to editors for freelance work. And so I had no idea what a game writer was. Like, I never met a game writer the entire time I'd been a journalist, and no one had sat me down with me and said, this is our game writer, they never really talked about the writing in games, or if they did, it was usually, here's our designer that also does some writing, but it wasn't talked about. So I didn't know what I was getting myself into. It just seemed interesting. And that is generally my career path, is just like, oh, this seems interesting. We'll try and have a look at this. Oh, let's go over here. That's my whole career path. It's just sort of like
I love it. But so what I love, there's so many things here. To unpack. For one, I think a similar pattern that you talked about, and we've had a couple of people on the show who are from the UK, is this difference in gaming between the United States, like, right? And like where you have consoles and so forth, and the kind of the big computer-like gaming that you had in the UK during this time. So I think that's really cool that you also highlighted that, and I know a lot of our audience is going to really relate to that. But another thing that you mentioned that I think is really cool is just this idea of how careers develop, right? No one really goes to school or is like, I want to do that, and they do that, because a lot of times it's like, well, that's either it's been automated, people can't do that, or it hasn't been thought of. And so you kind of always are this scrappy person trying to get from job to job and so forth. And it's super interesting to hear that, considering, if y'all didn't know, Rhi here has another writer in her family, but this show isn't about him. This is about Rhi, and that's what I'm super excited about. But it's super interesting to hear that, it was scrappy, right? You were like trying to get job to job. It wasn't handed to you. It wasn't that. So I think I have the utmost respect for that. Just as I know that's how my career always is, right? Like, so I think that's super relatable, and thank you for sharing that part of your journey into games, and kind of how it launched into something really big. So we've been talking about, story writer, story creator, but what is a story writer, a story creator, and why is that? Like, how do they work in a game, and why is it important? Can we what can you give us a little bit more into that?
Well, I'd have to say, yes, it's definitely important. It's the most important thing in games. Get one now. So everyone's career, get one now. It is. Yeah, it does. What I find interesting about my career is I've been able to see things change quite rapidly over the last couple of decades. So I came in '98 as a journalist, and was even doing like little bits before that. And before that, I was a gamer. And so I've gone from a time when, like, there were obviously people doing writing for games, but they were usually designers, or it was usually a secondary thing, and there was very little importance placed on it, and there were no sort of real game specific writers, and so I've seen that change over I've seen storytelling get embraced, the narrative design, the rise of narrative designers, narrative directors, storyboard artists, big Hollywood names getting involved, awards for storytelling, like narrative tracks at summits, like a lot more focus from developers, from publishers, from players themselves. So it's actually really exciting to have been at the crest of that wave, being able to see it changing. And I often like it to the Wild West. Like, it felt like the Wild West when we were starting out. Like, it was just like a handful of cowboys trying their best. And then you watch the railroads coming in and the towns coming up. And that's kind of how it feels like. And so, yeah, it's been very interesting seeing that change. And I think, the role of the writer, and I do consider myself a writer, even though I call myself a writer and narrative designer. I'm probably writing is my core thing, and narrative designer is by necessity, usually because I'm working with, certainly back in the day, there were very few narrative designers who I was working with, so I often had to do that job as well. And so the difference being that the writers are as you think, they're more about the word bits, the plot, the characters, the dialogue, that kind of thing, the story. Narrative designer is more about the mechanics by which the story is told, so how the story gets to the player. And so some narrative designers write, some are purely sort of focused on communicating the story to the writer, and they usually have one foot in the design camp and one foot in the writing camp. So I think being a writer in games, there are some writers out there that don't play games, but it seems just completely strange to me, because it's like you wouldn't write movies without actually watching movies and things. But the number of people that still come up to me and say, "Oh, I'd like to give game writing a go," and they don't play games at all. They just, they're looking for work, or they heard that gaming is big and they want to get in on it. It's less frequent now, but yeah, lots of there were certainly writers that I know that don't play games. And to be fair, I don't always play story-heavy games, actually, because it feels a lot like work.
Makes sense.
Yeah, sometimes I sort of gravitate towards either games where I'm sort of telling a light story in my own head, or it's like an RTS and there's no story going on, or it's the story of the battle.
So usually I ask people, like, what are they playing currently? Are you playing a game that is like light in the story, but you're still like kind of interested, or like what are you playing right now?
I'm a weird gamer. I'm a really weird gamer.
I think all gamers are weird gamers, if you know what I mean.
Well, I spend more time playing older games than I do playing new games. And I tend to a game comes out, I wait 2 years until I play it, until the hype's over, and then I discover it for myself. That's generally how I work.
You should play Stadia, because that's how we all are.
Probably there's only been a couple of recent games that I've got on the day they came out and started playing on the day they came out, and that was Unavowed by Wadget Eye Games, which is a sort of fantasy sci-fi point and click game, and Unpacking, which is I'm sure you've heard of Unpacking. It's won a whole bunch of awards recently, and it uses a lot of environmental storytelling, and I found that joyful to play. But I tend to oscillate between two games that I play as sort of downtime, maybe to wake me up in the morning, or just to pass time sometimes, and that is Age of Mythology, the third Age of Empires game, which I
love Age of Empires, and I know exactly what Age of Mythology is.
So Age of Mythology was my favorite, so I still play that online, and it still gets, because I think it got it got sort of polished up in the last few years. There are more people playing it, but really there's only about maybe 70 people online at the most.
So you play with them all. You know them all.
I know some of them. Yeah, I know you get to know some of them. It's not the biggest talky game, so there's a few people I know, and there are a few players with strategies that I know, but I go back and forth. So I play Age of Mythology at the moment, and I always play Thor. I don't know why. I never even experiment with the other civilizations. I'm very loyal to Thor, and the other game that I'd say expert level in now is The Long Dark. Which is I don't know if you've played that. It's a wilderness survival game. And it's very niche. I've got a real thing for wilderness survival games.
Okay.
I don't know why. Well, actually, no, I do have a good idea why. But it's a sort of more unusual reason. I grew up in the countryside, and my dad was very into sort of a certain amount of wilderness survival. He didn't chuck me out of the house to live in the wild, but we would go for walks a lot. He'd teach me about what plants and berries and mushrooms and things were edible, and he gave me a little bit of low-key wilderness survival training, and I was obsessed with books that were about kids running away to the wilderness. Not because like terrible things had happened, but usually because they didn't want to go back to school, or they just felt like it and they went and lived in the wilderness. And I think one of the most famous American books for that from my is called My Side of the Mountain, which is which is set in the Catskill Mountains. There's one over here called Brendan Chase, and so I really like that kind of wilderness survival aspect. And it reminds me of my dad. So a lot of times I play things because I always joke on Twitter that Ghost Dad in my head is making me play X game. And like Ghost Dad in my head is quite fond of wilderness survival games. So I ended up playing The Forest, Stranded Deep, Among Trees. Don't Starve is a big favorite of mine, but The Long Dark, I've become an expert on that, and so I sometimes tweet about the interloper runs that I do, the very long interloper runs, to see how long I can survive in the game. And the interloper is the hardest mode, where you're just basically dropped into the wilderness with the clothes on your back and a tin can, and you've got to survive. And
I want to see this. You need to stream this, Rhi.
Well, I don't know anything about. I'm really nervous about streaming, and it would just be me like running away from wolves or falling down small cliffs and things like that. I'm not the most elegant of gamer, but I probably survived 1,349 days in an interloper run. Is my longest run ever, and I'm pretty proud of myself because. It is a very hard on. It's very hard on interloper mode, but I've got so many. I've got to know the game so well. I've got so many hints, so I help people out who are playing it. Like I was giving hints to John and Brenda Romero because they'd started playing it. Like, let me tell you all the things you need to do. And, I was playing that for a bit, and I started a new interloper run, and then sometimes it gets a bit too dark and lonely for me in the game, and sometimes I like that, and sometimes I'm like, no, I'm going to play Age of Mythology and little Vikings running about and hitting each other. Sometimes I need that, and sometimes I need the challenge of the Long Dark.
Just thrown out there.
Yeah, my boyfriends see me playing it so much. He was back home in Italy, and he said, yeah, there's a bird in our garden that sounds exactly like the noise that you opening a locker in the Long Dark makes. And like, that's how much it entered his subconsciousness, that this was like the squeaky sound of opening a locker in the Long Dark. But yeah, I am. Yeah, I would be funny if I streamed it, because I've never seen a woman streaming the Long Dark. It's all
I gotta do. What I got from this is when your father throws you into wilderness survival mode, you either become a deadly assassin or you become a game writer. So
yeah,
so y'all are in the same camp to me, So like there you go. But with that, so. That's super exciting. And I know some people in chat have played all these games, because we do have some wilderness survival enthusiasts. So what do y'all think of her 1,349-day interlope mode record? Put it in the chat.
I'm gonna be it's felt like I think I got like a 500 days. Well, no, maybe 800. I can't remember. I'm very boring about the Long Dark. I know it so well. I can talk about it. Yeah, and it's just, I find my father in wilderness survival games. So I can, because gaming was our thing. And I do like, I end up gravitating towards the games I think he'd like. And so I end up playing games for sort of both of us, like playing, entertaining his ghost, I think. And sometimes I think he helps me get out of difficult situations.
I think that's so amazing, because I lost my father a few years ago, and so like there's certain games that I remember he kind of played. So when you're saying like he's kind of there, the ghost, or like I can remember him kind of critiquing or saying jokes or stuff about that. So I'm not the only one who does that.
It's really nice. It's like, come on, Dad, we've got a headshot of bear now.
No, that's super. And I know we have a lot of fathers who watch the show, and so it is it does mean something when you play. So, and mothers, everybody should be playing games. So I know we talked about games, and I know, right, that I reached out because of Tomb Raider, and we're going to build up to Tomb Raider. But you have some other games that I kind of want to talk about because I do think there's kind of a central theme. See if anybody can find out what that theme is. But, a really, has a cult following. People are hoping that it comes out with its sequel soon. Fortunately, I'm not sure if it ever will. But you wrote, or you were a lead writer, or you were a writer. And maybe as we answer this question, you can talk about what the how you played in this game, or in this development. But Heavenly Sword, right? So this is one of the first games that were big games that you were kind of a part of. Not the first, but it was one of them, definitely, I would imagine. In this game, what I think is really cool about this game is there's some other female protagonists in recent games that a lot of people will say, well, Heavenly Sword did that first, right? So we have Hellblade with Senua and potentially mental health. We also have Aloy and Horizon Forbidden West. There's some similarities there. What do you think of those similarities? A couple of questions here. What do you think about those similarities? When you do look at those games, you like, oh yeah, like I may have started, was kind of the foundation with what you did with Noriko. Noriko. How did you kind of play into that? Like, how much control did you have on the actual character? And what do you think about, like, potentially they're coming back? And would it ever come back, in your opinion, to finish that story or that franchise out?
There was a Heavenly Sword 2 game in development in early stages with Sony a long time ago, and that I think only got written about when it got canned, and as far as I know, it wasn't very far along development, and that was being done by Sony Cambridge rather than Ninja Theory, and that obviously very long time ago. No one knew particularly what happened, and then it just sort of got a little bit into development and then fizzled out. Then there was a strange animated movie which I don't like. Ninja Theory didn't know about, and I didn't know about. I don't think Andy Serkis was involved, but it used like footage from the game. I think Anna Torv was involved, but it was, yeah, they made a movie of it a long time afterwards. Yeah, it seemed like maybe 8 years or something like that. It was a really odd one, and they used a lot of footage, and they'd sort of recast it and made it into a movie, and like the ninjas weren't involved at all. I wasn't involved at all, and we were all a little bit perplexed by it. Obviously, Ninja's been going great guns with Hellblade, and it feels like I know they've said it's not meant to be a sequel to Heavenly Sword, but it sort of feels like a spiritual successor. Like,
I mean, it's Heavenly Sword, Hellblade. Yeah. Like, it's like
it very much feels like it's. I think the Senua feels like a grown-up Kai. And it feels like there's I can sort of see that's what Kai, that's who Kai turned into after Heavenly Sword, when she'd sort of been released from the trauma that she'd been through, and she was she'd been given the chance for a future by Noriko, and it felt like maybe that's what happened to her, even though it's not the same character. It sort of spiritually felt like the same character. I don't know, Amy. I think there's been new Senua games announced, and so the Ninja are doing great with that. And they actually, so Lost Words and the first Hellblade, we both had grants from the Wellcome Trust, which was I don't know what would you call it, because I don't think it's doing the same grants now, but it was a sort of I'd say a scientific foundation that gave grants to the entertainment industry for projects that had a scientific angle to them, particularly biological, and in the sort of realm of maybe mental health, or anything in the big realm of science, not so much physics, but biological elements. It could be, something in a movie or a theme that's explored. So Ninja Theory used the Wellcome Trust because they were doing mental health issues, and so the Wellcome Trust gave them a grant. It also put them in touch with therapists, and they could sort of learn about kind of mental health and schizophrenia and how this manifests, how this is treated. And so it was really useful for them for Lost Words, because we had the kind of journey of grief in that, and it was a child going through it. We talked to child therapists about children going through grief and how they support them and techniques they use. And so that was very useful for us. So the Wellcome Trusts were great in supporting all kinds of entertainment projects that had a sort of scientific angle to them. And yeah, that was super useful for us. But yeah, I had a lot of fun with Heavenly Sword. It was a baptism of fire for everyone it concerned, because Ninja Theory hadn't done such a cinematic game before. I think the last game that they did before that was Kung Fu Chaos. And yeah, I mean, they've gone down the track of doing more and more cinematic games since then, and sort of exploring more avenues for this, which I think is great. And it certainly got Andy Serkis interested in games, and to the point where he was sort of joking about gameplay getting in the way of story and things like that. And then he went on and started the Imaginarium, which has a kind of games wing to it. And so I think games sort of opened up, the potential for games opened up for Andy, and it put me on the path of doing quite a lot of cinematic games, or games that had sort of cinematic parts to them, or I felt like a cinematic experience. So that's probably where my career kicked up a notch or two after Heavenly Sword.
Heavenly Sword, like I said, I was talking to someone, I mentioned Heavenly Sword, and they were like, just super fan of it. And I was like, oh my gosh, I'm going to be speaking to Rhianna Pratchett about it. And they were like, what? So thank you for giving us that background, though, on those other games, though, as well, because I did not know that. I didn't know about the grants. Everybody talks about the mental health in those games. But thank you for giving that background, because you were definitely part of it. So I'm going to jump to another game that also has somewhat of a cult following. It's pretty short as well. But Mirror's Edge, right? As you're writing this one with the protagonist, you have a sister now. Like, is that how the story unfolded? Like, did you bring that up, or was there something you were trying to explore there, or was that just how, like?
I don't know. I've written a number of sisters, and I'm an only child. I think I'm quite fascinated by sibling relationships because I don't have one, and so I probably observe other people's sibling relationships as well quite closely. But yeah, Kai and Noriko in Heavenly Sword, although they were adopted, they had quite a sisterly relationship. And there's a kind of funny sisterly relationship in Overlord between Rose and Velvet. And yeah, in Mirror's Edge, we wanted to kind of explore the sisterly relationship, and certainly sisters that are sort of
different paths,
different sides. Yeah. And like, for me, I mean, I came on quite late in the day, as I've talked about before, for Mirror's Edge, and a lot of the game had been designed before I came on board, and it had been designed with virtually no narrative in mind. So that means that, just imagine if you're trying to do a movie and a bunch of sets have been designed because they look cool and it might be good to run around, but no one's thought about how they connect together. That's a bit like the situation I had with Mirror's Edge. And so you have to kind of work backwards. You're like, okay, this is where the character needs to be. Now I have to think about how to get them there, rather than okay, the character is going here, and now the level design and the sets are being made for that. So it was kind of a real challenge, because of this sort of, really, not disparaging level design, really cool ideas, and it had, this aesthetic that hadn't really been seen before, but no one had thought about the why questions, like, why does Faith move through the world like this? Why is she a runner? Why does the city look like this? Like, what is outside it? Does it all look like this? Are there areas that look different? So a lot of my job was answering those why questions, like connecting the dots, like pulling everything together. That's a lot of what a writer does. And a lot of what I do when I'm sort of parachuted into a project, and I work freelance, so I don't work in house. I do sometimes. I'll go on site for a few weeks. I did with Tomb Raider. I always say I go on site to fight and I come off site to write. So I go on site to like have the meetings and like fight about the issues, and then I go away from the studio to actually write, because I don't find a working busy development studio the greatest environment to write in. And so I've never really had the full office experience and the culture of working for games, but I've sort of dived in and out of it a little bit. So now I've now talked so much, I'm trying to remember what my point was. Okay, no. Mirror's Edge. What was I talking about before that?
Sisters, but if you want to go to Tomb Raider, that is the next one I wanted to do.
So I sort of I dive in and out of things. I work off site, and with Mirror's Edge, it was I don't know if I was I can't remember whether the sisterly angle that like they wanted. It may have come, and it's very unexciting to say, because they wanted to reuse the Faith model, so they gave her a twin, because it's like Kate is identical to Faith, and I know they did want to. So interestingly, Mirror's Edge had started out as a multiplayer game, so it was originally meant to be kind of like a cops and robbers multiplayer, was how it was envisaged, quite a long time ago, before it came out as Mirror's Edge. And they've done a bunch of artwork for the characters, and then they've gone, okay, she looks cool, let's make her the protagonist. And there's another bunch of artwork that had been done as part of this sort of cops and robbers multiplayer game that never happened. And so Faith had been the artwork for that. So she existed as artwork. She didn't exist as a character. And so that, again, that's a lot of what I do, is, diving into a project. Okay, what have we got here? Okay, we've got some artwork, we've got some backstory. Okay, these are our ideas that have been put in the bin. Let's have a rummage around in the bin and see if there's you can find usually a gem of an idea that someone's thrown away because they don't know how to get it working. You go, oh, then this is good, but if we do that and we stick it together, like, you're always, it's like assembling Frankenstein's monster. So you're kind of like pulling all the bits together, sewing it up, and so you're never sure what you're going to be working with. And with that, there was a lot of constraints with Mirror's Edge, because of the level design that's already been done, and because of the mechanics as well. So I spent a long time thinking, okay, who is Faith? Who is someone who moves through the world like this? Who would have made this choice to live this life? And then sort of working backwards, like, who is this person? Okay, what has happened to her to make this make her live this kind of life? Like, okay, she's running, but psychologically, what is she really running from? And like, what would make her stop running and actually face up to some things? So I often use gameplay as the root of character psychology when I can, and it's not always the case. But it was good with Mirror's Edge because it wasn't excessively violent in a shooty way, and so I had a little bit more space to work with. But ultimately, a lot of the story actually got cut, or certainly a large percentage of the story got cut at the 11th hour, because they decided they didn't EA decided they didn't want Faith to talk during levels. And at that point, it had all been written and the story had been balanced. So the stuff that she said in levels was pertinent to the story and the conversations she had with Merc. And they felt like it was too distracting for the player to have a disembodied voice. But their solution was to cut everything out from all the levels. So even if she was in
EA, not a good look, EA. Come on.
Yeah, I talked about it at the time, and I think it got me blacklisted from DICE. But it did not help the game. So there was, I mean, I don't know whether they had a problem with what had been produced, but we'd written the script and we'd recorded the script by then. So you'd have thought that at some point someone had said, oh, okay, this isn't working. We need to do something,
I hate that. I was just on a show.
It wasn't, I didn't get a chance to do it myself. And so it was sort of bittersweet. I got to do the comics with DC Wildstorm, and they were really fun because I could do a lot of stuff in the comics I couldn't do in the game. So I could explore like how Faith became a runner, how she met Merc, what her situation with her family was, what led the city to be like it is, how she got her tattoos, that kind of thing. So I was able to explore that a lot more, and it was really cathartic, I think.
No, I love it. So I learned a lot right there. So thank you for sharing. And so y'all who really like games, go read the comic as well, because what I'm hearing is that a lot of times those may be able to provide some background that the game, not due to the writer, due to some bureaucratic bean counter somewhere else, or someone with a great idea, not so great idea, making the decision. So this leads us to Tomb Raider, right? And so as my audience knows, I've been streaming Tomb Raider, and now what you said, I actually kind of feel a little bit bad about how I've been characterizing Lara. Because in my mind, I'm like, here she is. I don't want to ruin anything, but I kind of look like she put herself in this situation in a little way. And but talk to us about like that process. Like, wow, that's a big game. It revamped a whole series. It went from being Uncharted had kind of stolen the show with so much so people were calling him Dude Raider and everything. This one really put Tomb Raider back on the map. What was that like, and what are some of the decisions you like, some of the freedoms you had and some of the freedoms you didn't have with that game?
Yeah, I mean, when you work on AAA games, there's a lot of the freedoms you don't have. Like, there's not a lot of freedom when you're a writer on a AAA game, because unless you are a writer that has hard power, so meaning that you're also maybe the game director or the creative director, if you're that and the writer, you usually have more hard power. So people like Amy Hennig, Neil Druckmann, Ken Levine, who are game director, but they're also writing the story as well. So they have hard power on the team to to say, we're doing it this way. This is my vision. Whereas if you're a writer, even a lead writer, you're still having to, there's a lot of diplomacy involved. There's a lot of understanding all the battles that are going on. There's a lot of trying to accommodate everyone's views. There's a lot of having to be very flexible. There's a lot of trying to find little corners where you can be rightly or try and get your vision across in smaller ways. It's a lot easier on indie titles and titles with smaller teams. But on the big games, you get, the shininess, you get access to Hollywood actors and the best of the best and bigger budgets and things like that. It doesn't always equate a better game, but it means that you're going to have a kind of more freedom in the way that you express the story, and in terms of like the budget you can afford, you can do more shinier cinematics and things like that. So there's sort of advantages with each kind of type of game. I got involved with Tomb Raider because I was working on Thief at the time for Eidos Montreal, and I was recommended by the producer there to the franchise director of Tomb Raider because they were looking for a writer. And I had an interview with a couple of the folks there. I did an audition piece, a couple of audition pieces, which I think it was a cutscene. And interestingly, it's the I don't think I'm that kind of Croft cutscene that I wrote in my audition. And so it was actually long before we'd probably even fully worked out what kind of Croft she was, but I just did it as a sort of audition piece, playing with some ideas. And I did a couple of extracts from Lara's diary as well. And I got the job, and that was great. And Crystal were very open with what could be done with the character. And I think we did have the idea that we were going to start sort of planting in more classic Lara stuff as we went through, like the twin pistols. Obviously, we've got the Lara's home, Croft Manor, her father, that kind of thing. We had some idea that we were going to start sort of planting in classic stuff, but really they wanted to explore Lara at an age and a point in her life which hadn't really been explored that much before, and sort of show her becoming the Tomb Raider and taking all the kind of traits and abilities we think of with Lara Croft Tomb Raider, bravery, tenacity, resourcefulness, and just sort of winding them back a bit, so they're still there, but they're bubbling up to the surface, and she's being tested coming out from this at the same time, the first time, and she doesn't know what she's capable of, and some of what she's capable of actually frightens her, and she's like, it shakes her sense of who she is, I think, and so she's going, what I like doing in games, and they don't always lend themselves to it, but looking at the internal journey of the character and the external journey of the character, and how those mirror each other and intertwine. And so she is going through a very physical journey, but the mental journey that she's going through is every bit as difficult for her as the physical outer journey she's going through. And so it was for a long time it was just me doing stuff, and working a bit with the creative director, Noah Hughes, and then saying, please, can we get a narrative designer? And then we ended up getting John Stafford, who did a lot of the secondary writing on the first Tomb Raider game, and was a senior narrative designer on Rise, and sort of keeping the pieces together. I did a lot of, I guess, the heavy lifting parts, the kind of central story, the central cinematics, the Lara associated stuff, the Lara's diaries. So it was just the two of us, really. It was very, there were some expectations, but I'd say not as heavy as the second game. It was sort of nice because people were like, oh, I wonder what they're doing. Whereas with the second game, it was very much weight of expectations, and we expanded the writing team to 4 people rather than 2. And yeah, so it feels so long ago. It was, I think, when I think of the 2 games, I think the first one, the second one was more polished, and the first one had more heart. Probably because it was less polished, and the first one was more heartful and scrappy, and it will always have a place in my heart, because I think the themes were very strong. I think the themes,
they are
external versus the internal journey, were very strong in that. And with Rise, they were sort of a little bit more nuanced, and Lara was that bit further along her journey. But they were both great games to work on, and John is still heads up the narrative team to Crystal to this day.
No, that's so. Like, now I feel horrible because in the game I am always like I was like, they must have not liked pilots. Because, that was one of my things. I always criticize that they don't like her to have good friends because
were you a pilot by any chance?
No, I was not a pilot, but I was just like, they don't want her to have friends because bad things happen to her friends. But now that I hear, like, you're right, it is about more of those things, about her kind of growing up, like just realizing who she is And I guess it's like me playing the game, realizing that I actually kind of like the chick. So maybe that's my parallel path with her. But now Rise of the Tomb Raider, you also wrote that, and that's where you won an award for that. You're the lead writer for that, and so what did that feel like to take the story? You were like, okay, I took those raw materials. Here I have a better team to polish it up. It's a longer game. It has a lot. She goes on a longer journey, right? She's not just on an island anymore. What did that feel like to lead that team and to bring that to life?
I mean, it's been it is interesting with how like lead designer was on, or sorry, not lead designer, lead writer was on Tomb Raider and Rise compared to other experiences of lead writer that I've had. I mean, it sort of felt, certainly with the first Tomb Raider, it just felt like John and I were doing it together, even if I was called lead. In some sense, it meant lead meant the writer that is doing that's probably
the most writer.
The most writer, yes. Although certainly I was there first, and I was helping create the wider view. But John and I were doing most of the heavy lifting together, and I was probably doing more work on the cinematics. With Rise, I actually did not expect to get the lead writer credit. I don't think anyone else would have, but I wondered if they just call us writer, because I sort of was doing a similar thing, but it was almost like I was, I guess, leading the writing in terms of doing the majority of the cinematics and the Lara stuff and the Lara and her father stuff. John was probably doing more of the traditional leading. So sort of, we had a second narrative designer, Cameron Suey, who was in-house at Crystal. We also had Philip Gillette, who's done some great work on Love, Death and Robots and Spine of Night. And he was sort of coming in and just doing work where it's needed. Like, okay, he's doing a bit of secondary narrative. He's helping polish up the scene. He's doing like little bits and pieces. And sometimes we were all getting together to kind of talk around scenes. And so it's not as lead writery as I've seen some lead writers be. And I've been involved in writers' rooms and things like that, where I've seen a lead be more of a traditional lead. So I was, I guess, the kind of vision lead, but I don't think I had the power of a lead that I would have if I'd been in-house. So it was sort of, I was quite surprised to get the lead writer credit, even though I'd probably done the same job, just because it didn't feel like a lead in the kind of more traditional sense. But it was great to be able to take Laura on that journey, and John and Cameron and Phil and myself all got on very well, and we all worked together very well. And it was nice to be able to expand the team out a bit more. And I think the weight of expectations was a lot more on Rise. It sort of felt like, John and I, I think we've done a good job with the first game. And it resonated well, and I think we thought, oh, it's going to be easier second time around, and it was not easier. It was definitely harder, partly because weight of expectation, partly because it became an Xbox exclusive, and so there were so many more people having opinions on the story. And certainly, as many writers on AAA games know, the central story, the more cinematic story, that gets the eye of Sauron. Everyone wants to have a view on every single scene and everything you're doing with Lara, and they're not necessarily well versed in storytelling or character creation, or even sort of reading scripts and being able to envision what a scene will look like, when it's fully realized. And so they wanted to open up the cinematic script early for feedback, because we'd had a situation with the first game where I had written the script and we'd gone through a few iterations. And so one of the things you were mentioning about Lara and not having friends because her friends die That was a gameplay decision. Like, I literally had to do death drafts. So I'd kind of written the script, and we were sort of tinkering around, and sometimes, you know, a bit of a level will be chopped out, so you have to sew that back up, or, oh, okay, bit of gameplay's changed, and she's here instead of here, so we've got to change the intro to that scene and how she exits. But they would say, okay, she's going to go off on this mission to rescue this character who will ultimately die, and so we go back.
No spoilers.
Write the character out of all future scenes, and I did that a couple of times.
Oh no!
And so
that wasn't your fault. It wasn't your fault.
Yeah, it wasn't me, I'm afraid. Yeah, I hate killing off characters. It's very,
okay.
it's really difficult for me.
All is forgiven. All is forgiven.
So yeah, there were gameplay decisions, but what I think is interesting, and was an interesting learning experience, was it changed the tone in ways I didn't quite expect. So because, you know, it had been written with not quite so many deaths, so we had a bittersweet ending. But after we kept killing off characters and everyone kept dying, and is this just this cavalcade of death? Like the players were like, oh, the ending is too dark, and we've got to change the ending, and it was because the tone had shifted from when I'd originally created it, and you know, it was, you know, absolutely fine. But I understand the reasoning from the level designers about what they wanted to do, and they've got their own battles and things like that. But yeah, it changed the ending, so we ended up having to rejig the ending quite late in the day, and the way I think Crystal thought, oh, this was a problem with the script, but it actually wasn't a problem with the script. It was actually learning how gameplay decisions affect the tone, and how the tone can affect the whole script. And really, it just became, there was just too much death. And
I am glad you're actually affirming when I talk about it, people will tell you what I talk about. And so I'm glad that this conversation happened, and that y'all were recognizing that.
It was, we had a lot of characters to work with Tomb Raider, which was quite difficult. With a lot of the characters, the crew had been sort of designed. I think when I came on board, they didn't really necessarily exist as characters, but there's a lot of artwork had been done, and they had originally envisioned a multiplayer that was maybe a little bit more like Left 4 Dead. Okay. So the multiplayer characters would have their story going through, exploring parts of the island, and they'd intersect with Lara's story. That was the original plan a long time ago. I wasn't involved with how the multiplayer came out at the end, but so they'd actually designed a lot of characters, so they wanted us to use all the characters in single player, and multiplayer changed to being the multiplayer that came out with the first game, and it wasn't a story orientated multiplayer, which is what it envisioned. So like, okay, you've got to use all these characters. It's just like, oh, okay, we have to. So squeezing all those characters into a small amount of time was quite difficult, and we couldn't do as much like character arcs and, you know, deepening the characters we wanted. But thankfully, comics came in. Like, you got to do the comics, so we put a lot of stuff in there.
Wow.
And so yeah, you're always working with these limitations, and sometimes limitations can make you, you know, very creative, and sometimes, you know, depending on when those limitations come in, it can neuter things, and it can be sort of very difficult to work with. But this is the fun of writing for games, is that, you know, you're always having to be flexible. You're always having to keep one eye on what gameplay is doing, level design, mechanics, you know, what play testers might be saying that might affect the narrative. You know, thinking about, is the narrative saying one thing and the gameplay saying the other? Good old Ludo narrative dissonance. And we're fighting against that a lot with Tomb Raider, in the story we wanted to tell for Lara and her character, and the story that was being told through the gameplay and the mechanics. And then they clashed, and they were at odds. I mean, I'd be the first one to talk about that, and I have talked about how, you know, Lara's first kill was not how we originally wanted it, and we fought back against her going from 1 kill to just killing loads of people.
I made this comment. I was like, how is in 1 hour she kills a deer, then she just becomes deadly assassin. Deadly assassin raised with
it was
survival.
not, again, it was not originally like that. So I've talked about that because I think it's like, I understand everyone's point of view and everyone's sort of battle that they were fighting for the particular discipline and department. So, narrative wanted the death to be impactful and actually for her to act more or less like you might if you just forced into killing another human being, no matter the circumstances of it. And gameplay were like, but you've got a gun now, and we know once we get a weapon, we know we go around the corner and there's something that we're going to use the weapon on. And so play testers were saying they wanted, she had a gun and therefore they wanted to shoot the gun, obviously. And when I originally wrote that scene, there were no deaths in between her the first human kill, and there was a scene with her talking to Ross when she hears him. I can't remember it's the first time or the second time, but it's certainly the first time after she's done it, and she just breaks down hearing his voice, and she sort of confesses to him what she's done, and he says that can't have been easy, and she said it's scary how easy it was. And that for me was a sort of a change in Lara. It's like she's seen something in her that she's capable of doing that she didn't think she was before, and that's sort of like it's scary to her. And I originally wrote that scene like she had the walkie-talkie, and she, her body language is almost going into a fetal position, cuddling the walkie-talkie, and it was supposed to be a sort of intense scene. So between the first kill and reflecting on the first kill with Ross, no kills. And then like the first time, then level design mechanics and everything got involved. I think it was like 32 kills in between first kill, reflecting on the first kill. And we were like, what? Like, this is completely mugging the what we're trying to say in the story, that this is
I feel so affirmed by you saying this, because I have brought this up. People continue to tell me, Purple, you're being too hard. I'm like, no, like this isn't, but this is super affirming to hear that from you.
It's not no, you're definitely not wrong to do it, because I do think it's important for developers to think about these kind of things. But the narrative department, certainly on the first game, we're a small department. We all we can do is try and fight the battle that we can, and we're not always going to win. And so we did fight a bit of the battle. They reduced it to, I think, 16 kills, which is still, it's still a lot of kills. And so when she talks to Ross, she's like, I had to kill some people, and it's like,
yeah, I think I said this.
And instead of like the emotional scene that I'd written, it was the same dialogue, but she was climbing a ladder at the same time. Like it was done as a level design conversation. A level dialogue conversation, rather than a cinematic. So it kind of lost the impact of reflecting on it. And I often talk about that because it's like, okay, I understand where everyone's coming from, but you've got to see, like, when I write for movies or TV, we all say action equals character. So what a character does tells you as much about them as what they might say. But action is a completely different department in games. They may not care about narrative. They may have completely different goals to the narrative department, and yet they are in charge of something that is fundamental for expressing the character, and that's not usually a priority for them, and it sort of makes it see that, like, writing a narrative is everyone's responsibility. Like everything folds into narrative, animation, level design, music, mechanics. It all contributes to the story, and it's all telling a story, and you need to try and make it tell the same story and not different stories. And so I've been very open about, like, this is what it was, this is what happened. And I do think Crystal did realize that, and John and I were like, we're going to get dinged for this, like reviews are going to bring it up because we've made a big deal about Lara acting in a more human-like way, and you've just got her like clicking into kind of badass survivor mode, and it just like, you need to give moments room to breathe.
Yeah.
And that can be really difficult in a very high adrenaline game like Tomb Raider. And it is one of the biggest challenges of first-person and third-person shooters is, you know, the gameplay is usually saying one thing, and it's very difficult to match that with what you want to do with the story.
Thank you so much. Just thank you all, because I think as you're explaining the battles you're having to fight, I think it's really crystallizing or bringing home like what your role is. You're advocating, I think, on behalf of the players experiencing the story. Like that is your and it like really brings to light so many different things. Like I don't think people would have realized like, yo, gameplay and storytelling and potentially the music, they're all on different pages, they're all on different things. So like to see a lot of times, or a lot of, not sometimes, right, and sometimes that these decisions aren't on the create. Like you have these beautiful games and people are like, it's so beautiful, but this is off. And so it I think you explaining that really brings home the importance of cohesive teams. And but also now I have to go back and play the game with a different perspective through it.
Well, I think anything you see like that where it seems like, oh, this is weird for the character, or this doesn't feel right, there's probably a poor game writer in the background that's like suffering because of this, and they're thinking, that was the battle I tried to fight and I lost.
Oh my gosh, I'm gonna take and then also really key point is to go see if they make a comic to see what they do.
Yeah, like all your answers, all your characterization. Yeah, I had a lot of fun with the comics because I could let Lara be a little bit more goofy and a little bit more like classic Lara. Like I wasn't allowed. People talk about, oh, you know, they really enjoyed classic Lara because she had the sassy one-liners and things like that. I would have been totally down with doing that kind of Lara, but Crystal, and I completely agree, and I get this, we're like, but that suggests confidence. That suggests a level of confidence she does not have at the time.
Yeah.
And so they didn't want that kind of Lara. And so I kind of brought a little bit of that back in the comics. So she does do more one-liners. She is goofy and silly. I do explore her relationships with her friends more in the comics, and kind of what it's like to be the one that has to save everyone, you know, to kind of be the hero and try and hold friendships, and you know, what do you do if you're the one that saves everyone and the one that has the answers and things like that. And I like looking at, yeah, the hero and the human and all the gritty kind of drama and conflict in between those.
No, well, I know we're running long, but this has been super helpful. I have, you know, you mentioned something earlier that you always have to kind of have a foot into gameplay, foot into story, like as you're going about, and you know, I think this would be really cool to hear your perspective as someone who's worked with indies, who's kind of also just media in general, especially as we see interactive entertainment, like so many different media sources coming together in a unique way. You know, what I'm thinking about is like, we call it interactive media, right? Interactive gaming. But in your opinion, where is gaming going? And especially where is game storytelling going in the future?
Gosh, I mean, I think we're going to see gaming actually infecting, in a good way, in a good infecting way, more other entertainment media. So we're already seeing aspects of gaming coming into like TV shows like Bandersnatch, for example. And although Bandersnatch, I think, annoyed the games industry a lot because we've been doing exactly what Bandersnatch did for decades. And there was a lot of, oh my God, Bandersnatch is revolutionary, and it's a new way of telling stories. And it's like, no, it's an old way of telling stories if you look at the way the games have been doing that. But I think we will see more of that. I know interactive theatre is becoming much, much more popular, and those interactive theatre experiences and having more story and involving the audience.
I love murder mystery dinner murder mystery type of things, like where they're running around. So.
And like we've got companies like Punch Drunk over here that do big immersive theatre experiences. So I think lots of we're seeing movies, a lot more movies coming out that aren't just gaming franchises but are using themes and ideas pulled from games, like Free Guy, for example, not based on a particular game but based on something. As a gamer, you understand about NPCs and how they work, and so there's a lot of fun there. Things like Wreck-It Ralph, for example. I think we're going to see a lot gaming permutating a lot more in the entertainment medium. I mean, interesting to see how VR and storytelling increases. I haven't seen anything in VR yet that has the storytelling chops that's hit me as much as storytelling in other gaming mediums. But I'm really interested to see what it does and how that evolves. And I think it's such a kind of new medium that I think we're still kind of finding our feet. It's almost like starting gaming over again with VR, because we're sort of learning how to use the very specific medium to tell stories, and how to keep the player looking in the right place, and not being too confusing and not making them ill and things like that. And there's a lot of things we're learning with VR, and my experience of it is quite minimal, but I'm really interested to see what they do there. But I think
one of our viewers, Mr. Urban World, is a huge VR person, so he's going to love to hear you talk about that, and I would love to see what his opinions are in chat. But keep going. I just want to.
Yeah, I was. I've only played a few VR games. I played during the pandemic Arizona Sunshine with my partner, because we both got VR headsets, and we've got a large enough kitchen that we can stand in different parts of the kitchen and play the game together, and that's quite fun because we have to avoid walking into the fridge or like the cat attacking one of us usually. But I was like surprised at how little story it had in it. And there were no other characters, and I kept wanting to, okay, this is when the story kicks in. Nope, still no other characters, just some voices. And I'm thinking, because I was so used to a lot of storytelling in zombie games, from the Half-Lives to the Left 4 Deads, to The Last of Us. It felt really weird and retro that there was no real story. Like, it was still a fun shooting experience, but it was like, I was expecting a lot more story because there's so much story to tell in zombie survival games, and there was very little of it there, and there was very little environmental storytelling as well, which I was surprised about. So, and I know that that's a lot of the limitations of the medium. So yeah, I'm going to be interested to see where that goes, and I'm always up for like recommendations. If you want to jump into my Twitter and recommend good story games in VR, I'd love to check those out. But I also think we're going to see writers getting more hard power in the industry. We're going to see more writers becoming creative directors, becoming game directors, starting their own studio, and kind of being the vision holders. Because it's very difficult when you're a lead writer if you've got someone who isn't involved in the writing who's holding the vision, especially if they don't really understand writing, or they've maybe become a vision holder because of the design side of things, and they don't really care about the narrative. That's very, very hard to work with, and it's not uncommon to have like someone above you that doesn't really understand storytelling, and so you're in a situation where you've got to educate someone who is technically above you in the like chain of power about something, and that can be a interesting and challenging experience. But I think we're going to see more writing teams, more writing rooms. Like I spent 10 months in an Ubisoft writing room, and it really was like the best experience, with 3 other writers, all with different levels of experience, working on world building and lore and story creation, character creation. Really good fun, like one of the best collaborative working experiences I've had, just like a TV writer's room. I just worked like a TV writer's room. Getting on Zoom every day, going back feedback on previous work, giving out work for the day. It worked so well, and I hope more games are going to start embracing writers' rooms, because more writers, the more voice the narrative has, and the more voice the narrative has, the more power, and the more that it gets listened to. Not necessarily all the time, but we still suffer from the fact that narrative wasn't really considered in the past. Like 20 years ago, no one really cared that much about it. It was still being done, and obviously it was cared more about in adventure games, but and some role-playing games as well, but by and large no one thought about it that much, and literally anyone who had the time and inclination could do the writing. And now we're getting specialist writers, we're getting specialist writers' rooms. Sometimes Hollywood is getting involved in it in a more positive way now. Like went through a phase in the noughties where Hollywood people were being dragged in, and then no one knew how to talk to the Hollywood people, and Hollywood people didn't know how to talk to games people. So scripts were getting done in a Hollywood way that didn't really work for games, because the writer didn't understand the games, and the developers didn't know how to talk to the writer to express what they needed. And usually some poor game writer would have to come in for a fraction of the pay and sew everything back together again. I think now people are becoming much more game savvy. There's a lot of younger Hollywood talent that is now building their own studios and projects and getting involved in games and interactivity that is helping things. We're seeing more Hollywood talent coming in to do kind of voice acting and mocap. The narrative designers now standard really on a team. Writers not quite as much, but narrative designers have been around for a while. Narrative directors, there's much more focus, and I think that's going to grow.
Awesome.
And hopefully, writers getting power, getting hard power is really I think that's going to really increase the level of story and the coherence of story, I think, as much as anything. Because if you can hold the vision in someone that understands narrative but also understands gameplay and understands how to get the gameplay and the narrative telling the same story, that's when you get really good stuff, I think.
Oh my God. So I love this, because as someone who really likes stories with a lot of narrative, or loves games with a lot of narrative and storytelling, I love you speaking that, especially in this space, just because I think a lot of times in the game industry or the game ecosystem, we focus a lot on graphics, which are good performance, all that is definitely great. But there definitely also needs to be that other side that maybe hasn't got as much love traditionally. And I understand historically why that is. But there's room for everything to get better. And I think in games, that's definitely a part where it can happen. Well, Rhi, thank you again so much just for joining me here on Shades of Purple.
You're very welcome.
If I can just have you stay on just for a little bit longer as I do the closing loop here. But for everybody else, thank you for joining me. Future Purple, tell everybody thank you for joining. I know you're in the chat doing a lot of stuff. But thank you again, Rhi, for this. And with that, this is Rhianna Pratchett, amazing writer and storyteller. And I'm Purple Haze. And as you all know, the proof is in the playing. All right. Thank you all.
Great. Thank you.